Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank. This is episode number 19. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'll be hosting for you today. I've got both of the boys on the line, Christopher Sofsky and Teld, a.k.a. the Tarmogoyf Committee. How are we doing today, gentlemen? You here to quibble about whether Tarmogoyf still holds up in 2024, or are we beyond that?
I think Goyf is probably coming back by popular demand.
We received Tarmogoyf's application and promptly put it into the paper shredder.
I don't know. I think popular sentiment might be important on this one.
Man, Goyf has so many defenders. Like, I always feel like people are, like, onto the fact that Goyf's just not that good anymore. But people, maybe that's a incendiary statement, but anytime we talk about cutting Goyf, like, it's probably the most contentious card, right? Whenever we cut it from the cube, it's like, How is Goyf gone? Goyf's such a classic. It's like, classic does not mean good, but...
People love their 2-mana 1/2s, okay?
I think it'll get a little better with the addition of, like, the last 5 fetch lands. I think, honestly, the main reason that I'm thinking about Goyf is not, like, if the section was, like, bursting at the seams tight and we needed every effect in the section, then I would be... like, I really don't think so. But we have kind of a bloat in the 3-drop section that I think needs to be addressed. So
yeah, look, we do things for you, the listener. So if you're a Goyf stan, like, this isn't even about us anymore. What did you say yesterday? You said we're providing a service to the community. So, like, if people are strongly voicing that they want to play Tarmogoyf, we probably do it. But I wonder what happens when they're like, what's like the worst card you can think of that people could advocate for? I don't know, something terrible. They're like,
I think another 2-drop that we haven't looked at in a while that I actually think is pretty solid value is Wildborn Preserver.
Blue-green, here we go. Blue-green flash, y'all. Here we go.
No, what I'm saying is I think without a blue-green flash deck, the flash on it is kind of irrelevant unless you're trying to, like, ambush a blue flyer or something. I just think that the second line of text where you can dump extra mana into creature size might actually be kind of solid.
Yeah, I sort of like that it's a green creature that isn't, like, explicitly wanting to play with other green cards. That's one problem our green section does have, is that most green cards just want to play with other green cards.
Yeah, especially Defiler, which we're not running right now. But yeah, Defiler was like the king of wanting to be in a mono green
Doesn't
deck.
Preserver have that dumb non-human text on it? Like, that's one thing I just hate about the card is when it's it rarely matters, but then when it does matter, it's like, gotcha. It's such gotcha text, but...
Well, and people, and myself included, will forget about that and, like, misplay the card and be really sad. So maybe that's like a death sentence for it. I don't know.
Chris loves cards like Wildborn Preserver and then wonders why, like, we tease him about, like, Mystic Snake being on the client during the set review and stuff like that. It's like, let it go. Blue green flash is not going to happen.
Guys, what if they just printed 10? What if they just print 10 more, crazy flash green creatures? I'm surprised he didn't try to sell us on the desert package and to put the rattlesnake in.
Oh, the rattlesnake.
Yeah, I'm willing to accept that, like, Simic is just always going to be kind of like straight up Simic is probably always going to be the redheaded stepchild of our format. But actually, I don't know if it's cool to say redheaded stepchild anymore, but I'm not worried.
That's
about
fine.
it.
I'll edit it out in post, or I'll just like edit it back in multiple times and like really.
Or just like make the sort of like the skit at the end of the episode just like my distorted voice saying redheaded stepchild in a bunch of different ways.
We're burying the lead a little bit. The big news here, the biggest news actually, the Jank Diver Unrestricted Cube is no longer referred to as the Unrestricted Cube. It is simply the Jank Diver Cube.
Which has actually been kind of weird in discussions when we're, like, talking about the Peasant Cube versus the, like, Unrestricted Cube, because that feels so natural. It's like, the differences between the Jank Diver Peasant Cube and the Jank Diver Cube are, and it's just, it's a little fun. I've been referring to it as shorthand as the mainline cube.
Yeah, I should probably. I've still been saying unrestricted because everybody in the community knows, but new people coming in might not know what that means. But yeah, it wasn't lost on us the fact that like it was called the unrestricted cube, but we did an episode like 2 episodes back that was like, here are all the cards banned from the unrestricted cube. Like we understood, and we were discussing name changes for a while. So our mainline unrestricted cube, as it were, is just the Jank Diver Gaming Cube now, and everything else is like an offshoot of that. So Jank Diver Peasant Cube.
No restrictions except for like the 13 cards we've explicitly banned and like the 25 more we don't play because of polarity or power.
Yeah, and in celebration of that, we have more bans!
Yeah, I wouldn't call like Preacher and Sentinel of the Nameless City bans. I would call them benches, but no, they definitely need to be swapped out. For those of you that are listening that are playing like more powerful cubes that overlooked Preacher because it kind of has a simple text box, we actually found it to be like a ridiculous powerhouse.
We've had a number of people. I mean, I've said for a while, I think in the community, there's been a lot of sentiment that I agree with, that it's the best black creature and one of the best creatures in the cube. I know not everybody agrees with that, but I think it is a growing sentiment that it is very, very good. And it's extremely snowbally, plays defense really well, plays offense really well.
Yeah. Teld said there were a lot of people in the community. What he really means is there were 3 people in the community plus Drix, who has the voice of another 7 people. So, so I know you're listening, Drex. It's not a jab. Appreciate you, but
yeah, no, Drix, if you're listening, we love you, but damn, dude.
So we are an hour and a half into our recording now. We should probably get to the main topic. Before we do that, of course, I do want to plug our Discord community. It's just been so great to hang out with people, especially I have some personal stuff going on in my life. It's been great to have this community behind us. I want to say thank you specifically to Chris, yourself, Necroid, a couple other people who actually donated to my mom's GoFundMe. I won't go into detail on that there, but that meant a lot to me. So thanks for being part of the community. If you want to be part of the community, first off, you don't have to donate to my mom's GoFundMe to be part of the Jank Gaming community.
It's actually a requirement now.
It's the pay gate to get in. But yeah, if you want to come join us, there are links to the Discord wherever you're listening to this. It's an awesome place where we just play a lot of Cube, and we've got so much Cube going on. We've even got Chaos drafts that are now scheduled throughout the week. There's a lot of magic happening, especially at the beginning of a new set. We're not going to get into details about Outlaws of Thunder Junction Limited here or anything like that, but it's been really sweet to see people's like draft picks and these broken packs that they're posting, like what's the pick and stuff like that, plus people streaming their games and everything. It's been a really fun time to just be part of the community, and you should come join if you're listening and you are not part of our community. I don't know like how much overlap there is. I imagine like 85-90% of the listeners are people who are already in the community, but if you're one of the 10%ers, like get in here, give us your hot takes, tell us what we were wrong about on the podcast, or preferably what we were right about.
Yeah, come Curry goes.
Yeah,
I'm not crazy about the term 10%ers, because in the contemporary political time period, it kind of sounds like you're part of a right-wing militia. So like let's not call
11%ers.
The 11%ers.
2%ers, like our milk. Anyway, okay. Let's go ahead and transition into what we're talking about here today. The topic of this episode is going to be how to evaluate cards for your cube. And a lot of that is obviously going to be us talking about the parameters we use to evaluate cards for our cube. And there's a little asterisk here. A lot of what we talk about doesn't apply to Vintage Cube, because Vintage Cube, again, as we say every time it comes up when we're talking about like cube building exercises and stuff like that, Vintage Cube has its own set of rules where like kind of anything goes. I would say it's the Wild West of Magic, but you can't really say that anymore thanks to Thunder Junction. So it's like Vintage Cube does its own thing. A lot of card evaluation tools don't necessarily work in a cube like ours as they do in Vintage Cube. So we're going to be talking about like the kind of modern power level cubes that we play with and similar things. So if you're trying to get better at evaluating cards for your own cube, hopefully we can give you some parameters to work on. One thing I wanted to start out with here, if you guys don't mind, before we talk about our own parameters, is I wanted to bring up some of the tools that people are used to evaluating cards for retail limited, because I think that's what gets quoted quite often. But I wanted to ask you guys a couple of those real quick. So the first thing, for example, the vanilla test. And we talk about on this podcast a little bit how like the vanilla test is dead because stat lines are big, but like
dead as hell.
Yeah, at some point we probably just do a whole episode on the vanilla test and how it doesn't work anymore. But when you're talking about like 3-mana 3/3, you know, that's still something that you're interested in, or something has to be at least a 2-mana 2/2. Like how much, when you guys see a new set, how much does the vanilla test actually matter?
Ever since they printed, what was that? Is it Gem? It's the green card where like the creature Jewel Thief. Yeah, it's like, okay, I can Centaur Courser, cool. Can I interest you in a 3/3 Vigilance Trample that effectively costs it, like refunds one of the mana you spent on it? That seems pretty good. So 3/3 Vigilance Trample Lotus Petal is like the new standard for uncommons. I think in
that was a common.
Ixalan. Oh, it was a common. That's right. Yeah, God, that's absurd. That's got to be one of the best cards in like every Pauper cube that it's in.
Funny enough, not the best common in the set.
Yeah. And then in Lost Caverns, they printed like a 4/5 reach for 4 at common. So yeah, the vanilla test is just like not a thing.
Well, I guess the question is like, how much does a card need to pass the quote unquote vanilla test in order? Like, you see a 3-mana 3/3 that's like kind of just below the bar if it doesn't do anything. But if you see a 3-mana 3/2, is that throwing up red flags for you? Like, just on stat lines alone?
I think it depends on what the card does. So, for example, right now we're running Delny, and we did consider cutting this card partly because the stats are so low on it, but it's a 2/2, right? 3-mana 2/2 is definitely below the bar, but we've seen Delny get cracked in half in the appropriate deck, where it was just the amount of value it generated was way higher than its stats. And most of the times creatures are overstated these days, so like a 3/3 for 3 is just not an appropriate stat line because it's too small. But I think it's just that we've reached a point where stats do matter. I've said that before, that one of the things I've learned is like toughness especially really matters. But I think stats matter less than effects in Modern Magic to a certain extent. Like really, really, really powerful effects you can get by with a lower stat line. Obviously, most of the time you just get both now, and they're just radically overstated. But I don't know how much like the vanilla test exists in any capacity for Cube anymore.
Well, I mean, and I might be off base here. I'm just kind of like spitballing here, but we've like arrived at a point with stats where I think like value creatures, you almost want to have conventionally vanilla stats now, right? Like, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point we just see like a green or white common that's just like a 2/1 for 2 that draws a card on ETB.
Yeah, a good example of like not needing the stat lines to line up with the established vanilla test is Llanowar Visionary. You know, that's a 3-mana 2/2, but it's just a rock solid green creature.
Just ramps and draws a card and goes well in Vamp Blink.
You get more than 3 mana's worth out of that card, I think. If you consider like drawing a card is probably worth a mana, plus tapping for a mana is probably worth a mana, you know, and a 2/2 is probably worth 2 mana. But yeah, the vanilla test is it needs revamping for just retail limited in general, and then for Cube, like your stat lines have to exceed a certain point unless the utility of the card is really good. There's also the quadrant theory, which is credited to limited resources, which basically says like when you're looking at a card, you have to determine like how good it is when you're ahead, how good it is when you're behind, so on and so forth. I'm not sure how much that one applies to Cube design, because you do have slots like your Llanowar Elves, which are obviously terrible in the late game and amazing in the developing stage and pretty bad when you're behind and stuff like that. So like I think cards get away with being in certain quadrants to the point where you don't need them to be like well-rounded.
Is with quadrant theory, was it ever proposed that you need to have your cards be good?
No,
it's an
evaluation
quadrant
tool
theory
of like where does this card lie, and then if it's like terrible in like all the quadrants, like you wouldn't play it.
Sure.
Or if it's only good in one, I think would be like problematic.
Yeah.
My point is like, if I remember right, the 4 quadrants are like when you're ahead, when you're behind, when you play it on curve, and
parity.
At parity, ahead,
right,
behind, and when you're developing, which is always kind of like a nebulous term anyway.
Yeah, I usually refer to that as just on curve when you play it at the appropriate mana value. So like Llanowar Elves at 2 of those quadrants is insane, right? Like it is extremely good when you are developing, like when you're at parity, I guess, like in the early game. Like I don't know, maybe it's just so good in that one quadrant. Like I don't think quadrant theory would lead you to believe Llanowar Elves is a bad card necessarily, because it generally sees every time that kind of effect comes up, people always evaluate it very highly for retail limited. I actually think quadrant theory is much more valuable than the vanilla test, though. I think if we're going to use something from like when you look at like cabs and bread and all these other things, I don't think any of those really apply to Cube, but I think the quadrant theory definitely has some value. And when I'm thinking about cards, I'm kind of thinking about like, how are they when I'm ahead, behind, even board, when I play them on curve, when I draw them late. Like those are things that I'm thinking about when I'm evaluating a card. So I think that is a lot more relevant.
I'm of the opinion that traditional quadrant theory becomes increasingly relevant the more a card costs. Right, because like in cubes, like your decks and your archetypes are a hell of a lot more focused than they are in retail limited. Like you actually have like dedicated one drop aggro decks in a lot of traditionally designed like fair formats. So like quadrant theory doesn't apply to a red one drop,
Right.
because what's important about the red one drops is like you have to be developing fast in an aggro deck or you just lose. So it doesn't matter that your one drop sucks late, because it's so important that you have one on turn one. Right, like that one drop. Now, one drops, like obviously there have been recent limited formats where one drops are really good cards, but like traditionally, a lot of the limited formats didn't really have like hyper focused aggro decks, so one drops were just pretty bad. But depending on the design of your cube, like that's just not relevant at all.
I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, we've
Really?
talked before that we actually do care about one drops being more relevant later to the game. That's part of the reason why I know you Chris, cover your ears, but Thraben Inspector is the best one drop because it is good, relevant into the game. It's a relevant draw at all points of the game, which makes it universally different than something like a Savannah Lion that is good on turn 1 and dead by turn 2.
No, that's totally fair, but Thraben Inspector is still not a great draw if you're behind, right? It's a better draw than Savannah Lions if you're behind, but like
Sure.
one drops like don't have the oomph to be like you're not happy to draw Thraben Inspector on turn 6. You know, it's better on turn 6 than just like a random
Teld
aggressive
specifically
card,
is happy to draw Thraben Inspector on turn 6, so I might not be, but Teld is like, oh, Thraben Inspector, and gets hit by Kogla next turn. He's like, thank God I drew Thraben Inspector.
Gave me 6 life and drew a card.
Yeah, so like quadrant theory can be used as an evaluation tool. Certain quadrants matter more than most, but again, it's not going to turn, especially when you get to like 7 drops. Like Titan of Industry just fails a lot of parts of the the quadrant theory, but it's the same thing as like having a Hornet Queen in limited, like where it's like this card is so powerful that it's allowed to fail certain quadrants because it's so good. I would say if you're thinking about quadrant theory for cube design purposes and a card does not excel in any of the quadrants, it's probably something you should consider. Like, why? Like, if it's just not good early, not good late, not good pair, like, and it's just average across the board, like it might not be.
Well, it's probably not a powerful card if it's not good in any of the quadrants, right?
I'm interested in this too, though, because, you know, if we talked about the 4 quadrants are like developing at parity behind ahead, like doesn't Hornet Queen and Titan of Industry just still like steamroll 3 of those quadrants? It's just not good when you're developing. It's just like you need to have the mana for it, but once you got the mana for it, it doesn't matter what your board position is. It's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I guess it just slams the door on a lot of those quadrants. I guess the alternative would be Lane of War Elves, which is like good when you're developing, bad in a lot of other spots. So, stuff like that, but like it excels so much at that developing state. It's like the best developing card you can have. So like the fact that it excels at a particular stage in the game or a particular board state means that that's something that is in consideration for your cube.
Teld, Llanowar Elves is the best one drop in the cubes, to suck it.
To wrap this up, I think one of the things I would say is that, like, compared to retail limited, it is much more acceptable in cube decks to think of them in a constructed sort of facet where you are putting cards in your deck for a very specific purpose. It's okay that Land of War Elves is in our deck for the first couple of turns of the game and not because we want to draw it on turn 6 or 7. Whereas in retail limited, you do generally want, like your 2 drops, for example, you'd like them to have more relevance later into the game. And there's some aspect of that in cube, but also you're just willing to put a card that's just exceptional at turn 2, like Karzeth, for example.
In terms of quadrant theory, like the best way to summarize my thoughts on it for cube is like your 4-drop better be good every time you cast it.
Yeah, the farther up the curve you go, the more consistent. We'll talk about consistency here in a moment, but
4-drop better always be good, says man who loves Rankle.
Rankle is always good. You watch your mouth.
There's a little bit of disconnect between what I'm talking about here, because on the retail limited side, I'm talking about draft picks, and on the cube design, I'm talking about cube slots, which are a little bit different, right? But the last thing I wanted to mention here, as far as like a standardized, whatever you want to call it, evaluation tool in retail limited, Teld, you mentioned this, but Cab's theory, which again, I think that's credited to limited resources. It's cards that affect the board state. Basically says you only have so much room for cards that don't either directly add to your board or remove from your opponent's board. When you're looking at a new set and you see cards that don't affect the board, but maybe have a cool effect, like, what is your stance on those for adding them to a cube? How much room is there for cards that don't affect the board? Like, what I guess, what is the bar for a card that doesn't affect the board to make it something you're interested in a cube slot?
So I guess would this be like the spot where we get to talk about a card like Tyvar Stand that doesn't directly like you don't it isn't a removal spell. It isn't adding a creature to your board. It does affect the game state in some capacity and it's extremely powerful. But would that be something that would fall outside this Cabs theory?
I guess that falls in. I actually, now that I'm mentioning it, I'm like, how many cards do we actually play in the Jank Diver game and Cube that like fall into non-cab? Like, how many cards don't affect the board? And it's probably like virtually none outside of things like draw spells and counter spells, which you could argue a counter spell does affect the board, but like, I mean, how much room is there for things like Chart a Course? How much room is there for things like Unearth? Unearth does affect the board, you know? Like, we play so little of this, so it's kind of like, if you saw something that was like a really cool draw spell or card advantage engine or something like that, like what bar does it have to meet for it to be something that's worth a cube slot over something that would affect the board?
Touching back on something that Teld said earlier, I think Cab's theory kind of breaks down in cube design, especially if you're doing like a more novel or themed concept and you need to start thinking about card evaluation more like constructed than classic limited.
That's fair. Yeah, and I'm looking through like our red section. I don't think has a single card that I would classify as a non-Cabs card. Like Faithless Luden. I guess Faithless Luden's the only one, but like, I guess if it's doing something very specialized for a specific kind of deck, then that's the bar you have to meet for a card that doesn't affect the board.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could argue Monstrous Rage, you could argue Embercleave. Like, those don't necessarily... This is where there's kind of a gray area, I think.
Sure,
yeah, Combat Tricks fall in that spot, where they're really powerful cards, but your opponent kind of has to play into them for them to actually impact the board.
Green cantrips. I guess a good example of this is a card we just added from this last set, Trash the Town. Which, you know, that's the green spree spell that you can tack on different modes to put 2+1/+1 counters on a creature, give a creature trample, or give a creature whenever it hits your opponent for the turn, draw 2 cards. Like that's a non-Cabs card. It does put counters on things, but doesn't like directly add to your board or remove from your opponent's board. Like what is it about that card that makes it make the cut over something that is just like a fight spell, you know?
Yeah,
right.
I guess where I'm landing after this discussion is I don't think that Cab's theory in specific design cubes actually matters. I think that whether or not like Cab's quote unquote Cab's theory applies is wrapped up in two concepts we're going to talk about, which is sort of like archetypal significance and consistency. I think that the framing it in those two concepts is more important than quote unquote Cabs.
I think Cabs in Cube could be boiled down to like cards that consistently impact the board are just as a function of Magic generally better than cards that don't.
Mm-hmm. They're the cards you're going to be looking at anyway for your cube slots.
Your control deck needs to have card draw and stuff, but your interaction is the important part there, right? Your mid-range deck or your aggro deck needs the creatures, like all of the draw spells and stuff are kind of secondary functions. And a lot of times now we get cards that impact the board and do both. That's part of the reason why, for example, Prosper is a very high rated card amongst the community, because it is an amazing defensive card that buys you time and then starts drawing you cards and gives you the mana to play. It does everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's also why we were so high on the, what's the blue factor fiction, the Thopter fiction, whatever it's called.
The blue factor fiction.
I meant to say.
I get you. I get you. I'm just being a bitchy dipshit.
I didn't even realize I said that. Intrude on the Mind, like that does affect the board, so that's why we were so gung-ho about it. It's like, oh, we get a draw spell that actually affects the board. Like, that's a huge deal.
Yeah, and broader cube community out there, I know that, obviously it's no Mystic Confluence or whatever, but I think a lot of people speculated, publicly at least, that giving your opponent some agency is really bad, but like we're here to tell you, having gotten a lot of reps with it, that it's actually you can engineer a lot of situations where your opponent's agency really doesn't matter and you're getting a really good deal no matter what you do.
I'll tell you that's a fun card to resolve too. Like it's not it's not always cut and dry what you should do. It is awesome that like no matter what you do, you usually get your mana's worth. Like you could just fumble it completely and still be like ahead on the exchange, but I resolved it a lot in my least recent roto draft, and like every single time I had to like actively like think about the size of the token I wanted to make versus like what cards I wanted to be in the other pile and stuff like that. So it's a really fun card to resolve, a little skill test in, which I like.
It also frequently for your opponent is kind of the damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like it's you feel really bad, like you don't want to click either button.
My favorite thing to do with it is to put like Treasure Cruise as like the 1 and the other cards as the 4, and it's like, okay, you can either effectively let me Treasure Cruise now, or you can give me a 4/4 and let me effectively Treasure Cruise later. So like, in which way would you like to be fucked?
And I'm going to make a 4/4 if you don't give me 4 cards, by the way. Awesome card. I love that. Also, maybe we need to come back around on how blue has changed so dramatically in the last 2 sets or whatever, but that's part of the reason why.
Yeah, blue doesn't really have the blues anymore.
Turns out that's red, but...
Yeah, blue has kind of progressed out of the underdog era and is now in the villain arc.
Nowhere,
people are starting to actively hate it, which I gotta be honest, like, it's funny to me that there are players who are like, man, blue's really bad, and like now that like their early plays are all getting countered, and then like the turnaround starts happening on turn 3, they're like starting to hate it. I'm fine with blue's villain status. It's supposed to be a bastard, and I love it for that.
I do think blue, like, I will say, just to wrap up this, we'll talk about it later at some point, but I think now that blue is no longer our worst color, it creates a lot of non-games that you feel like you had 0 decisions in, and it is, of course, as blue goes, the most miserable color to lose to, even as someone who is a control Andy. Like, I love playing control, and man, is control miserable to play against.
It can be, yeah.
It's not fun, but it is an essential part of Magic, so I'm fine with it existing the way it does. I'm fine when I beat it, too. Let's go ahead and talk about some of our parameters. So, Chris, you laid out a couple of, I guess you would call these categories of things to be thinking about when it comes to evaluating a card for a cube slot. And again, this is not when you're actually drafting a cube, because then the slots are all determined. But this is a tool for people who are building their cubes or wondering what to like out of the latest set, what to slot in, what to avoid. These are things that we're looking for specifically when a new set comes out, or even when we're looking through the old card file, to make a replacement or something. There are certain parameters that we're looking for, and obviously every card is not going to fall within all of these parameters, but they need to meet some of them in order for them to be a consideration for the cube. If they don't fall into any of these categories, the question is like, why are we talking about this cube in the first place? So, Chris, do you want to talk about the power level, just in general, power level considerations for a card that you're considering for a cube slot?
Before we get started, I just want to say, I think that these card evaluation parameters are it's not just like how we evaluate cards. I think that we have landed on some parameters that like you should be thinking about regardless of how powerful your cube is or what it's doing. And the first of those is really obvious. I'm not going to spend any time on it. It's power level relative to your target. If you're specifically designing a cube that is operating at a predetermined power level, like the regular cube curated by the Lucky Paper guys, like I'm sure that Anthony looks at a card and is just like, okay, this is more powerful than how I want cards to play, so I'm excluding it. That's obvious. If you don't have a power level cap, then this is something you don't even have to worry about. Boom, roasted.
For sure.
I generally agree, though. I think sometimes it's really easy to miss cards that end up being really powerful, or likewise, like underestimate cards a little bit. We've definitely been guilty of both of those from time to time. So while generically, I think a lot of power level considerations are pretty obvious, I do think it's one of those things of like, once you've set an idea for what you want your power level to be, pay attention to see if cards are radically over or underperforming.
Yeah, all of this comes with the caveat that like, if you find a card falls into one of these categories, you think a card is appropriate power level for your cube, and then after playtesting it's not. That's the wonderful thing about cube is you can adjust things, and you should. If a card like think Shieldred the Apocalypse for our cube, where we're like, yeah, this looks like a great 4-drop for our black section. All the decks can play it, and it's like, no, this card way overperforms. We just talked about Preacher of the Schism. This is the perfect example, right? Like, oh, this looks like it meets our power level. It feels like it'd be a good kind of Jundy rock card for our cube. Way overperforms. Let's go ahead and cut it. Same reason we don't play cards like Ragavan. Like, we never put Ragavan in because we recognize where it lies relative to the power level of our cube. And similarly, the other end is true too for cards that we think are too weak. Like Teld and I are probably going to discuss Dance of the Tumbleweeds for Peasant Cube, but we would never consider that for Unrestricted Cube, no matter how much we like it, because the power level is just clearly not there. So stay within your power band. And
what's kind of nice about cards that initially look underpowered is once you figure out that they're actually good enough, it makes you feel really big-brained. Just like, yeah, man, like, you guys didn't even think about this fucking card, and it's so good, you know what I mean? Like, as cube designers, isn't that a high that we're all looking for? Like, we figured out something that, like, no one else gets?
And then when somebody like 2 1s with the deck with that in it, you're like, yeah, I suggested that card. I thought it was going to be pretty good. I'm glad it's performing well. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
Play patterns. Talk to me about the play patterns that you're looking for in a card, or this is more the play patterns that you're trying to avoid in a card, rather.
Yeah, well, on the positive side, like projected play patterns, if like you are interested in your aggro decks like playing out in a certain way, like let's say you don't enjoy just like classic, like every card is just a turn it sideways kind of card. If you want your aggro decks to like operate on like a slightly combo axis or whatever, then that's I think going to make you interested in like certain cards that you wouldn't ordinarily like consider for aggro. But mostly what we're focused on here is whether or not a card has like a toxic pattern. I think like a classic example from our perspective is like really feast or famine cards, that's a good example. Somebody noted in here like Mom Elish Norn, and we're not saying that like Mom Elish Norn is like absurdly powerful or whatever, but it does like completely shut down certain types of value, which can be really unfun to play against, especially if you forget that it does that. You like play out your ether channeler and it doesn't do it.
Wrong card.
Oh, yeah, no, this is the one that is like a 4/5 vigilance that makes your opponent like pay not to eat shit every time they do damage, right?
The reason I mentioned this Elish Norn is because when it was released, I believe, Chris, you were like, this is, yeah. So just to read the card, it's 2 white for 3/5. It has vigilance or something like that, and it says basically whenever your opponent's creatures deal damage to your creatures or deal damage to you, they have to pay some amount of mana or lose life.
Oh, is it every time they do combat damage, whether it's to a creature or a player?
It's whenever your creature. The part of it, like the actual nuance of it, doesn't matter. I could just look it up and read it. But what happened was, Chris, I think you suggested this card. You're like, I'd like to see how this plays out. And my rebuttal to that, and the reason we never added it to the cube, was that you can read the card and see what the standard play pattern for it is, right? And it's not a play pattern that seems very fun or interesting at all. And I think you rebutted back saying, well, why don't we see if it surprises us? And I obviously like snap back like, well, what's the surprise here?
The art on this card is so cool.
It is very cool. Teld, thank you for putting the image up.
Wow,
there. So,
it is whenever a source an opponent controls, so not even creatures, it's like burn and shit too. Whenever a source an opponent controls deals damage to you or a permanent you control. So like wow, that is so fucking annoying.
And I think this is an example of a card where you see the play pattern. When you read the card, you know exactly how it's going to play out. And I don't think it leaves you room to be surprised. I think like it has a toxic play pattern. It's just going to shut the door on people so often. And another example I threw up here was Ohair Kalsum or Kazlam. That was the green god from Ixalan. And like it just doesn't leave room for surprise. It's a big beefy 6/5 trample that if it hits your opponent, you just get to free roll a creature from the top of your library into play.
And a land. Or a land. So
or a land.
Yeah, if you like get in for 3, it's just like, here's my Titan of Industry for free, you fucking idiot. And also here's my utility land.
The standard play pattern for that card is kind of crazy good, and that's the only way it's going to play out, and it's a play pattern we don't like, so why add the card in the first place is kind of where I was at with these two examples.
I think it encapsulates the concept of what I call like Ultra Baneslayers or Nuclear Baneslayers. Like, it's not a great play pattern, in our opinion, for a card to come down and be like, okay, you either tempo me out with Doomblade or I untap and win. Like, those play patterns don't tend to be very fun. I don't think a lot of people enjoy, like, Bone Horde Dracosaur coming down, being like, okay, you Doomblade me and I lose, or I untap and generate a lot of value and beat you to death.
Yeah, Elish Norn falls more into the like kind of obnoxious end of toxic rather than specifically powerful. Like it seems like a fine enough card, but the real reason that this card is not included is off of the annoying gameplay patterns. And we do look for that because the cube at the end of the day should be fun. And like, sure, you're gonna have a bad time at some point. Playing Magic, that's just going to happen. Yeah. There's going to be games that feel bad.
You're going to have a bad time playing Magic, folks.
Yeah, you should be able to look back, generally speaking, on your cube experience and be like, that was enjoyable. If you have something that is so miserable that just one card completely ruined your night, this is that kind of card that does that, right? The big Baneslayers, they create really, really toxic gameplay, and there's a certain aspect of like you want some creatures that are good at combat, but you don't have to have cards that are that kind of combat creature.
And your second bullet point here is community enjoyment, right? So, you want an environment where people are playing cards that are fun to play. It's part of the reason that we keep, I think Doug brought it up, but Golos is still in our cube and has been since the induction of our cube. and it's questionable whether Golos still belongs in the cube or not. But between Golos and Omnath, like there is a subset of our community that enjoys playing with those cards, so we keep them around. And sure, it messes up the draft sometimes for other people, but like people really come to cube to do that sometimes, so we make some concessions for things like that.
Totally. The last thing I wanted to observe in terms of play patterns is, and you may be interested in this, and there's nothing wrong with being interested in this, but in general, cards like Shieldred, Shieldred is just like a goddammit card if you don't have an answer to it. Like, you know, like I think, at least for me, like I emotionally completely turn off. I'm just like, okay, well, I can't answer that. So yeah, but cards that are completely and totally generic, they don't do anything fun or cool or have any like cool interactions. I guess like in Vintage Cube, there's like draw 7s with Shielder or whatever, great. But cards that are completely generic but extremely powerful are sometimes like not fun. I guess it's less of like a projected play pattern thing and more of like a community enjoyment thing. Yeah, in general, I think this can all, like cards that are completely uninteractable have this feeling too. It's like, okay, cool, there's your Carnage Tyrant, and I can't counter it, I can't kill it, and it's bigger than everything. Like, this is fun.
So I guess I lose, yeah.
I guess I lose. Yeah, so like I think this can all be summarized as like avoiding cards that just kind of like break down like interactive, fun ways to play out games, or cards that just like make your opponent feel like there was never anything that they could conceivably do to win.
For sure. I did, before we move on to the next point, I wanted to just mention like a couple other really toxic cards. There's Bloated Contaminator has Toxic 1. Skrelv has Toxic 1.
Misery Shadow is absolutely miserable. That's more of a miserable play pattern.
That doesn't have Toxic.
Toxic. Did you miss the Toxic joke? Come on, man.
No, I did. I just decided to,
Paladin of Predation, that thing has Toxic 6. That's a really toxic
Damn, dog.
So don't play poison in your cubes is what we're trying to say.
Finn. Play Finn.
Actually, that does, I would like to mention, that is one other thing. I'm just going to like insert this in here because I don't have it on our notes. Toxic is a good example of a mechanic that's fairly parasitic, right? It only plays well with cards that play like have Toxic, right? So just as an aside, like we've talked about this before, but cards that are extremely parasitic can be problematic in cube design. Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of times they're cards that only play well with cards that share that mechanic. You generally like for your cube cards to be a bit more flexible. That's all of that, and we're going to move on.
Parasitism is probably something we should have put in the notes here. But yeah, parasitic cards, if you have to reshape the structure of your cube for small payoff, it's probably not worth it. But ecosystem considerations, Chris, do you want to take that? Like basically just seeing where your power level lies across different archetypes, different colors and stuff like that, and making sure you're not introducing things that are going to like drive your worst color into the ground or bolster your best color to a point where like other colors may not be able to keep up with them.
Yeah, I guess this has a little bit of overlap with like the polarity concept that we did an entire episode about, but like let's say blue, and it's not for us anymore thankfully, but let's say like blue control is your weakest archetype. Introducing something like Toski, which can't be countered and makes all of your combat damage draw cards, is probably not going to have a great effect on your ecosystem, right? Because it's just going to shaft something that already is kind of like the underdog. And again, you know what, maybe this like interacts with the idea of polarity as well, but like playing cards that just like single-handedly shut down another strategy and that text like isn't relevant anywhere else, like Misery Shadow, just like, okay, like your Sacrifice or Death Triggers deck just, you know, literally doesn't do what it's supposed to do anymore. Like, that's not a great impact on your ecosystem either. So, and more broadly speaking, like when you're including a card or thinking about including a card, like really look at what the dynamics of your environment are, sort of the matchups between different colors and things like that, and ask yourself the question, like, is this going to have like a weird or deleterious impact to like how I expect the parts of my cube interact with each other? Because some cards will do that even if you don't expect them to.
Yeah, don't play deleterious cards, people. I don't know what that means, but don't do it. Chris seemed pretty confident in whatever that meant. So
I'm sure you should not play deleterious cards. Yeah,
don't do that, y'all. I mean, some examples of this: if red is your weakest color, probably don't play something that has protection from red, like in your non-red sections. Like that'd be a little weird.
Or stuff your cube full of life gain or whatever.
For sure. I think a good example of how we incorporate this is if you think back to the murders at Karlov Manor review that we did for Cube.
Who can forget?
There were a lot of enchantments and things like that were like, oh, rattle a bunch of spells off the top of your library. And I think every time we brought one up, Chris was like, not super into it, but also like these cards are just complete control hosers, like they're good against control. And that was at a time, 4 or 5 months ago or whatever, when control was 2 months ago, I don't know, where control was just like getting beat into the weeds. So, like, we don't want to introduce a bunch of cards that are just generically good against control and win against control on their own when control's not doing so well. So that's the type of thing to watch out for. If you can identify weak points in your cube, like maybe not just like egregiously weak, but obvious weak points in your cube, probably don't introduce new cards into your cube that makes that worse for whatever deck is already your weakest deck. Polarity, we probably don't have to get into Polarity here.
No, we covered it. We covered it,
so.
And I think we just kind of talked about it, impact on your ecosystem. Like, generally speaking, like, just don't play cards that really fuck against certain decks and are really bad against others.
Yeah, and we shouldn't get into that either, because Mop has listened to a couple episodes, and I think Mop like rolls his eyes whenever we talk about Polarity, but he'll get over it. Mop, you'll be okay. Consistency, this is one where I have a little tiny bit of pushback compared to, I think, specifically where Chris stands on a lot of things in Cube, but consistency is important to a lot of people and should be pretty important to most Cube designs. This is basically the idea that like a card that you play, you should be able to rely on it doing what it does the majority of the time. Like the absolute extreme of a non-consistent card would be like something coin flippy, where like it just doesn't do anything at all if you lose a coin flip. You don't want to play stuff like that for sure, but then there's also cards that do the same thing every single time. Like they're clean 2-for-1s. It's a Ravenous Chupacabra. It's going to destroy something when it enters the battlefield, or it's a counterspell. It's going to counter something when it does something. I think a great example of cards that I know Chris doesn't like are Cascade cards, or things with like Discover. What is it? Carnosaur? The Trumpeting Carnosaur is an example of a card that, Chris, I know you're not fond of, because it's a 6-mana play that will sometimes discover into a 1-drop and sometimes discover into a game-winning 5-drop. And that's just like, it's hard to parse out when that card is in your hand what the case is going to be for it. And sometimes you need it to do one thing and it ends up just doing something completely different.
Yeah, if you like Cascade cards and like those what's going to happen moments, like, I'm not saying that's bad. Like, if that's like something that you're interested in, then you should play those cards. What I'm more saying is, generally speaking, the more expensive a card gets, the more it should be good every time. I don't think it's a good idea to play 5-drop spells that require something to be going on the board to not suck. Like, this is a theoretical card, but like, I wouldn't want to play like a 5-drop where like the text basically means like this card slams if you're ahead and it sucks when you're behind. Like, you want your 4-mana spells to get 4 mana worth of value, With 1-drops, it matters way less.
Teld, where are you at on cards having to be consistent to be in Cube? Like, is there wiggle room? Does it have to do the same thing every time?
Yeah, I am personally a huge fan of extremely consistent cards. I tend to really like my cards to be reliable, to the point that I think this is maybe a detriment to my draft strategy as of recent, but I'm usually willing to trade a little bit of ceiling to get a more reliable output, which results in a lot of 2-1s, but a lot less 3-0s than I used to get, because I don't draft quite as risky. And one of the things, like, that tends to be why I like cards. Like, for example, we've been running Scrapwork Mutt, and like, that card is one that I bring up because it's a reliable card. It smooths out your draws really well. It's going to make your game, like, you're going to have a lot less non-games, but it isn't nearly as powerful in raw power as a lot of our other 2-drops. Cards like that, I tend to really like. Something like Hellspur Posse Boss that we just added. I know what I'm getting every single time I cast that card. There's no guessing if I'm going to get like blockers / pressure with that card. I just know I'm going to get it. And so like, I like cards like that a lot better than I like cards like Bloodbraid Elf, like Trumpeting Carnosaur, as like kind of the spin the wheel example. But there's a lot of cards. Delny's another one that I don't really personally like, because even though you can build your deck to be very consistent, and I like the idea of Delny. Let me rephrase that. But like, Delny's not a card that I probably will draft very often, just because it's the kind of card that you really need to have everything kind of come together for it to work. Delny sometimes is just a 3-mana 2/2 that does nothing. So that's the kind of thing, like, that's why I always harangue Chris about Rankle. I think Rankle is a really high variance card. I think sometimes it's like a complete backbreaker, and sometimes it is just a 4-mana 3/3 flyer that can't even attack it.
Well, with haste, but yeah, I take your point.
This is where I think differ very slightly from where you guys are, because I think there's room in a 360 card cube or even a bigger cube, especially in bigger cubes. I think there's room for a few cards that are like risk-taking cards that don't necessarily fall in line with, oh, this is always going to do the same thing. And a good example of this that I've been a stand for, that we're not going to rehash the conversation on, but Urgent Necropsy was that green-black 4-mana spell that can like pop a bunch of different type of permanents with collect evidence, but has the fail case of like sometimes this card's actually uncastable. And that's the type of thing that I would be willing to take a risk on. But I think the fact that the floors like actually can't cast this is a deal breaker for you guys and a lot of other people. And like, I totally get that. I will say that if you are going to take risks on a few cards, it needs to be literally a few cards, right? You want the majority of your cube to be consistent so that people who are drafting your cube know what's going on, unless you're doing like some dumb chaos cube or something like that, in which case like you're doing a completely different thing. But I think there's room for a small amount of risk taking on cards that might not do anything if the upside is something that's really powerful or really synergistic or maybe even just really fun in general. But it has to be left to a minimum. Like, you don't have a lot of room for stuff like that.
Totally. I think this concept like applies less to build-arounds. Obviously, if you're including a build-around, you know why you're including it. Although I would observe that like when you put a build-around in your deck, you want to be putting it in a deck that like naturally increases its consistency. If that makes any sense. So like, don't put Delny in your deck unless you have a lot of creatures that will trigger it. But when you do that, it increases an apparently inconsistent card by making it more consistent with the support around it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I will also say I think I'm a lot more amenable to cards being like build around engine-y type cards being a little less consistent. I was fine with like trying Monastery Mentor. I like Sedgemoor Witch, even though I think that card is kind of inconsistent sometimes. I think that's a sweet one. I'm a lot less amenable to it with a card like Urgent Necropsy because I just really value my removal spell killing the thing I needed to kill. I don't want to hash that out here. I do think it's a high ceiling card. I'm just going to go ahead and give.
Sounds like you want
to
hash it out, Teld. Let's do this. All right.
No, not again.
I'll play back the clip. I'll play back the clip from the.
Just to sum it up. I'm pretty cool with the floor on a build around being really low and then getting really, really high when you complete the build around, sub quest or whatever.
Yeah.
Side quest. I'm just not as fond of it when it's something that like the ceiling is a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1 and the floor is like, I can't cast this card.
I think one thing that is kind of universally true, in my opinion, is you don't want your expensive cards to be awful when you're behind.
For sure. To your point too, there is a overlap between build-arounds and parasitic cards, and a proper build-around for a cube doesn't really require you to go through and like support it with cards that aren't already there. So, for example, a good example of this would be like Drakehaven, which we actually used to play in our cube, and we probably went out of our way to add like an extra Cyclone card or two, but like we can't just slot Drakehaven into our cube and have it work. We would have to do a lot of restructuring, and that's not worth it at all. That's a parasitic card, whereas a build around like Dreadhorde Arcanist, which we don't play anymore because it just wasn't very popular, despite being really good when you were able to build around it, we could put that card in our cube and not have to restructure our sections at all because we're just naturally playing a bunch of 1-mana spells in a lot of different sections. You mentioned Monastery Mentor kind of falls in there as well, where it's like you're just going to have non-creature spells, so Monastery Mentor can slot in. It's just a matter of like, does this do the thing you want, especially in a white deck? And it can. Like, we saw people build around Monastery Mentor, and it was a fun card to take and try to do a Jeskai, like, spellsy kind of thing with.
Yeah, and I think sometimes cards can land in the middle. So an example of this was the Insidious Root Chalk Outline package we put in the Peasant Cube. We made a few changes to cards, but we just kind of side graded a few cards where like they were doing something similar, but like now instead of like Vessel of Nascency, we ran Binding the Old Gods. I don't know if that's necessary, but we swapped around a couple of cards so that way cards that did similar things maybe would interact a little more favorably with these engine-y cards. And those are somewhere in the middle where you're kind of taking cards that were like roughly equal. Maybe one is like half a letter grade better than the other one or something like that. But you're swapping them to make these engine cards better. And I think that's something that you can consider doing as well.
Yeah, like if we were to add Dreadhorde Arcanist back in, we'd probably at the same time be like, oh, is there another 1-mana spell we could add? Whereas if we were to add some card that's like, when you finish a dungeon, like it's like, okay, how many cards are we actually going to make room for things that say like, when you venture into the dungeon, do blah, blah, blah. And it's like, we're not going to do that. Like, that's just total parasitism at that point. Another parameter here to think about is the archetypal significance of a card that you're considering adding to your cube. Does it fill a need? Is the card slot into the archetypes that already exist? And this is something that doesn't really work when you're building from the bottom up. Like if you're just building a new cube, you have to establish what your archetypes are first. But for an established cube, you know what your archetypes are. You're supporting tap out control, maybe you're supporting curve out aggro, maybe you're supporting like late game ramp, stuff like that. But the cards you add to the cube should fall in line with an archetype that you support in your cube. And if they don't, you have to second guess whether they belong there at all. And I think a good example of this is the Flying Men. There are good Flying Men in Magic. I think Spectral Sailor is like a perfectly fine card. Terramander fits into certain types of builds. Like I'm stretching a little bit. They're not that good, but there are good Flying Men. You could build a Curiosity style deck, but we don't play Flying Men in basically either of our cubes, the Peasant Cube or the Jank Diver Gaming Cube, because they don't really fit an archetypal need. None of the decks that we play, especially none of the blue decks, really need a Flying Man type card, like a 1-mana play that's going to chip in some damage and maybe give you some value later. So we don't play them. And people ask sometimes, like, why aren't you on this 1-drop in blue? You know, why aren't you playing Delver of Secrets or whatever? Why aren't you playing Terramander? It's like, well, they don't really bolster any of the strategies in our cube despite being like decent cards in a vacuum. So if they're not doing that, my rebuttal to them would be, why should we play these cards? We saw this. I'm not going to like disparage anybody's cube design or anything, but we played a guest cube in our server. I don't actually even remember which cube it was, but they had a lot of Flying Men in their peasant environment, and it felt like they weren't really supported. They were just there because they're generically good cards. And if it were me designing that cube, I would take them out, because a card can be generically good but not fit into any deck.
Was this the same cube where they also told us that blue was really struggling as a color?
It might have been. I don't recall because I didn't actually play. I was just like hovering over things. But yeah, I'm not even going to say it's like a fault of that cube. That person knows what they're doing. They have very good justifications for all of the cards that they're including. But from our perspective, if a card doesn't fit a particular need or doesn't slot into an archetype that we actually support, like, why would we take a card slot that could go to something that actually does support an archetype to play that card?
Right. There's a reason the only 2 blue 1-drops we run are Hard Evidence and Sleep Curse Fairy. You know, they're the only ones that actually kind of fit what our blue decks are generally doing. And Sleep Curse Fairy doesn't fit into every blue deck either. It fits very well into the more mid-rangey, slightly tempo-y ones, but it doesn't fit very well into your hardcore control deck as well. So, you know, that one is very, very powerful, really high ceiling, and it is a bit of, actually, that might be a good example of another, like, sort of inconsistent card. That card is a card that kind of swings wildly in how good it is. And Hard Evidence is kind of the go-to standard if your blue deck is looking to make a play on turn 1.
Yep. Teld, you added a category here that I actually just appreciate this category in general, but why don't you go ahead and take this next bullet point?
Yeah, this is is it sweet / unique / new or novel. So Sleep Curse Fairy actually is a pretty good example of this. Was a card that we found to be mechanically very interesting and unique. We didn't have anything like it on the client when we received it. Still really don't have anything else like it. And it was something we were interested in testing because these are the kind of cards that oftentimes end up being really, really good. Sometimes they fail, but really interesting cards that are going to lead to gameplay decisions are cards that we really value. There's also what you refer to as the Tonk method.
The Tonk method. Try out the new card. People get so caught up on Reddit and in the weeds about whether a card is going to perform well and theoretical play patterns. And my approach is, if you have a new card, a new set came out, and you think something's interesting and could theoretically perform in whatever cube you're playing, and try it out. Like, play the card and see what the play patterns is or are. A lot of times, you know, it'll fail. And again, the glory of cube is you can just take that card back out and replace it with whatever you replaced it with in the first place. Alternatively, the card might just overperform and be great. Sleep Curse Fairy, I can't take credit for that one because I thought it would be on the weaker side, the inconsistent side. Turns out, you know, no pun intended, it's a little bit of a sleeper hit for certain kinds of decks. And had we not play tested it, had we landed on the line of saying, oh, you know what, this card's a little wonky, it could be inconsistent, let's not play it, I don't think we ever would have discovered that it actually is a good role player for certain decks. So try out the new card. Like, I say that every time. You mentioned Posse Boss, you know, Hellspur Posse Boss, you mentioned that this episode already, but we were debating whether that should take the spot of the Gutter Dweller in our cube. And my argument is, well, this card's new. Why don't we play the new card, see how it performs? And it's funny because Gutter Dweller is also like relatively new within the last 3 sets or something like that. 4 sets, actually. So like it's cutting new cards for new cards, but that's just how Magic sets came out. But I'm always a fan of like trying out the new card if you think there's something there. If there's a question mark about it, just go ahead and play the card. And if it doesn't perform within the first like draft or 2, maybe 2 drafts in, then, just cut it. Play whatever you were playing before.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've been trying to get away from is sort of the confidently incorrect thing. So like with every card that comes out, if you go on like the Cube Reddit or something, there's these people who have this completely rock solid opinion of a card they've never played, that this card is definitely worse than XYZ. And they will say that opinion for a card that they have never been able to test as if it were ironclad. And a lot of people are guilty of this, and we've been guilty of it before too, I'm sure. But trying to be less about that and think about the way the card might play and just try it out and see if it actually plays as well as you thought it did, if it plays better. I mean, well, one of our classic examples is we thought Sea Shark was a cool card that wasn't going to be particularly powerful, and that card's insane. It's like best blue card in the cube. So, that's just like a pretty big example, but don't go in having these extremely strong opinions when you don't know. Like the intrude upon the mind for some people looks like bad factor fiction, but the fact that you get a body and you get all this value wrapped up, the way it actually plays out is super powerful. Like I remember when Shoulder came out, and I was one of these people who said the same thing, but a lot of people said this is just like bad Siege Rhino. And like, I'll take the L there. There were a lot of people who thought that card was just going to like, all right, you're going to play it and it's going to die to a Doomblade and you're going to have got no value. And then that is not how the card plays.
Doesn't die to Doomblade, but whatever. I mean, good example. We talked before we started up the episode here about the new Magda, the 2-mana Magda that makes a treasure whenever you commit a crime. We've played the unrestricted, the Jank Diver Gaming Cube once, maybe twice since that card came out. And that was enough to feel out like, oh, the play patterns on this card aren't quite what we expected. We thought it was going to play out like this. It plays out a little bit worse than that. It's cube. We take it out of the slot and we replace it with something that we know performs well. Like it's that easy. But I mean, you got to play with the card first. So you can theorize about how good Magda is going to be or how bad Magda is going to be, but until you actually see it in action, this is where playing a lot of retail limited really helps too, because you just see these cards come up and you're like, oh, this is the use case for this card, or this card performs way better than we thought it would. Maybe we should consider it for cube. That comes up as well. Chris, I'm going to let you take this next point because it feels like me and Teld were bouncing back a lot on that one.
No worries.
Qualities of established quality. I don't even know what that means, so I'll let you kind of iterate.
Let's say characteristics of established. So this one's really basic. Like we have just kind of found over the course of playing this cube at this point hundreds of times that blue creatures really want flash and flying. If you're playing a lot of counter spells and instant speed cantrips and stuff, like a card that may not initially look super powerful, like in blue, I'll look at like again if it has flash and flying, because those two characteristics have demonstrated themselves to be so crucial for blue creatures. Blue creatures tend to be dinky, so if you're playing like an aggro control deck, like playing a blue creature that doesn't fly in a very creature-centric cube, especially a creature-centric cube in a Magic design context now where, like, everything is big. Yeah, like, if you're going to play blue creatures that have the intention of dealing damage to your opponent, they should fly, and having flash makes them just play really well with other blue effects, which tend to be at instant speed. The same thing goes for First Strike in red. It turns out that First Strike is really optimized in a color that has instant speed burn that can blow out combats in conjunction with First Strike. So I will look at a card with First Strike in red and consider that more significantly than I would maybe a creature in other colors in terms of how powerful I think it is overall.
Trample and green.
Trample and green.
Right.
Yeah, trample and green.
There was a point in our early Peasant Cube design where we realized trample was like an essential part of how green needed to play in that cube. And I think at that point, they were kind of limited in when they put trample on cards. But nowadays, I think they've recognized like trample is a key piece of green. They've also recognized that like you need 4 mana 6/5s to make green playable or whatever. But Trample in green is like an essential. Or that whole unblockable text. Like, Quest and Beast doesn't have trample, but you can't block it anyway, so whatever.
Yeah, I think a good example of this is the green armadillo from the newest set. It's a really good card. Let me just preface. I'm not saying it's a bad card. It's a very, very good card. But it's a 6-mana green creature that does not have trample, which means that it is a very mediocre creature in terms of attacking. It's a great stabilizer, great defensive creature. It'll block, really, really well. But if your deck is trying to actually kill your opponent, it's a lot less enticing than like a Sifter Worm or something like that is going to actually attack into your opponent.
Spinewood's Armadillo. I mean, an example for the upper echelon of the cube, too, would be Ulvenwald Hydra. The fact that has reach instead of trample is like a big killer for it. I think if it had trample, like we could actually consider it as a card and it would still be on the weaker side, but they actually just throw reach and trample on everything now.
Yeah, I was going to say, if they released that card today, I think it would have both.
Yeah, Railway Brawler has reach and trample for some reason. Like, they just kind of give it to you everywhere now. But they've recognized, like, green kind of needs those things to push through all of these dorky token generation things that go on in Magic. And it doesn't feel like green just gets brick-walled by, like, a token generator or engine or something like that. So, yeah, just play into the strengths of your color, I guess, is the main point here, which brings us to the last point, something I mentioned quite a bit, which is slot equity. I think I throw this term around like pretty loosely and have never actually like defined what it means, but it's pretty self-explanatory. It's just the idea that when you're building a cube, like you have limited space. Let's say you're in a 360 card cube. Every card you put in a particular slot needs to be the best use of that slot, or at least a good use of that slot compared to every other card that could go in there. So this is where things get a little bit different from evaluating cards in a retail draft, right? Because when you're drafting, even if you're drafting cube or drafting retail limited, you see a pack and you look at a card and you think, does this go in my deck? And the answer is like a yes or no question. But when you're designing a cube and you're determining which cards go in slots, it's no longer a yes or no question, but a comparison between a bunch of different cards. It's, does this card use this slot better than every other card I could consider in this slot? So you're looking at like a black 3-drop like we were doing today, and we've got a list of black 3-drops. What we're trying to do there is pick the best black 3-drop for our cube, knowing that excludes every other black 3-drop that we could play in there. So it's up to us as the cube designers to make sure the card that we've selected is the best card for the slot, given whatever's going on in our environment. And maybe that changes over time. That's how you make upgrades and stuff like that. So cube equity, basically, like, the card I'm evaluating, does this belong in my cube? Is it a good use of my slot versus whatever else I could be playing? And like, you're going to experiment a little bit. Again, that Tonk method, try out the new card. Sometimes to try out the new card, you're going to play it over something that you know is like obviously better. Like Delny comes up a couple times this episode already, but it's a good example of a card where like, whatever white 3-drop we cut for Delny is probably consistently better than Delny, but it's cool, it's new, and it gives people something interesting to build around. It's probably not, from a slot equity perspective, like the best use of that slot, but we're making exceptions for it for a couple different reasons. People enjoy having build arounds. It's newish. We want to see what it does. It has a high ceiling. It's not consistent, but it has an exceptionally high ceiling. Like, if a card is inconsistent and doesn't have a high ceiling, we wouldn't even consider it. But Delny's a good example of one that does have a high ceiling.
I think one of the things I would say here, too, is this becomes more and more relevant the higher up the curve you go, because in most sets, there's going to be a couple of, 4s or 5s or 6s of like every color, right? But in terms of cube space, you really only have room for like, let's say 3 to 4 4-drops and like a couple of 5s in most color, maybe like 1 6, 1 7, something like that. You really only have room for the one that is the absolute best fit for your environment. Unless it's something like, for example, Horned Lockwhale is secretly, it's like a 2 and a 6. So the fact that it's like a playable 2-drop means that you can include it to fluff up the number of 6-drops you're running without actually impacting your density that much. But outside of cards like that have some sort of modality, adventure or channeling or whatever, your true 6-drops, your true 5-drops, you only have a very small amount of space for those. And so it doesn't matter that they print something cool like Calamity in OTJ. Like, if we're really trying to max that slot, I mean, it's Inferno Titan or Carnosaur if you're wanting something different. Those are just generically more powerful than what Calamity is offering, even if that card is really cool and has a really high ceiling.
Well, maybe not even more powerful necessarily, but Inferno Titan is the most consistent of the bunch and has a high ceiling. Like, it's consistent and, as Chris says, it does the thing every time.
Sure.
And it's a powerful card. Calamity might have a higher ceiling than Inferno Titan when it actually does the thing, you know. But sometimes it doesn't do the thing at all, and it's a 4/6 for 6, which is not acceptable in certain circumstances.
I think that the most like cut and dry example of slot equity would be like utility lands. So, and what I mean by that is like, okay, you could design a section. And this is, of course, assuming that you have, let's just assume for the sake of argument, you have this many good utility lands that are actually impactful to play. You could design a red section where like 20% of your section is utility lands, and those utility lands will always make decks. But if you're including 10 utility lands at the cost of like the density of burn you need to make your burn deck work, or like the density of creatures that you need to make an aggro deck work, that's not a good use of slot equity, even though theoretically those cards are like always going to make decks, because you're eating away at a density of other effects that you need to make your decks work, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, you should, if you go to our Build a Cube series episode 2, when you were talking about the density experiment, if you like follow the density experiment to a T to fill out like a monocolored section, you should end up with a couple flex slots where you can kind of play whatever you want. And that's a great place to play your utility lands or your like one-off non-cabs theory type cards. But you need to make sure like the first 48 slots of that section are filled with necessary cards for whatever archetypes you're trying to support. And then like, you know, however you want to use those last couple slots, you know, the slot equity is up in the air at that point. And utility stuff is a great way to fill those in. Utility lands are usually great, but you can't play like 6 utility lands in a monocolored section.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, I think that's just the most cut and dry example, like of the balance between like cards that will always make decks versus are you getting there on the number of playables you need for different decks.
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, in Cube, you're pretty guaranteed to hit playables. That's not really something that you run into. So if you want your aggro deck to exist, right, your red aggro deck, you don't need to have, 30 aggro creatures necessarily. Like you know you're going to hit playables. You're going to have those cards that are shared, burn, and all that. So like you need to be judicious about what cards you're including and where in the curve, because like, for example, the farther up the curve you go, the less interested aggro is generally going to be in them. So you can give a little more equity towards aggro on the bottom end of your curve, because your mid-range deck maybe doesn't need quite as many of those because they'll be pulling from multiple colors instead of a single one.
Yeah. And I've already told Chris I want to at some point do an entire episode on slot equity, because I think it's a good thing to think about when you're designing a cube and like theorizing, what the best possible card for a given slot is. So we'll get into that. It is worth noting it overlaps again with that conversation about build-arounds and parasitic cards, right? Because a parasitic card not only takes up its slot, but requires that certain other slots. Like it requires way more cube equity than a single card that's just like a burn spell or a creature or something like that, because it's requiring you to give up something to play the cards that support it in other slots as well, which is just not worth it for like very specific kind of build around cards. When you think like typal things that are like, oh, if you play a bunch of knights in your deck, if you're not coincidentally playing knights already, then you're going to have to go through and like add knights to your deck that might not be optimal for whatever slots they're in, and it's just not worth restructuring your cube for that. So slot equity is a big thing on my mind when it comes to cube design. It's like anytime we talk about a new card comes up and it's like, should we play this? Like in my mind, I'm thinking, is this a better use of like the 2-drop slot than whatever 2-drop it would be replacing? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no, and sometimes the answer is I don't know. So let's try. That's when I revert to the Tonk method. Try out the new card, right? That gives me a better idea of whether it's actually worth that slot or not. I think a good example, Regal Bunnicorn, right? I don't know if that's the best 2-drop we could be playing in that section, but it performs well, and it feels like it deserved its spot in the 2-drop section. We'll go ahead and keep it around for now.
2 mana 8/8, pretty good.
It's no Tarmogoyf, but I'm whatever. If like, comment, and subscribe if you like Tarmogoyf. I don't know. Anything else you guys want to discuss here about card evaluation? I mean, these are just like kind of random parameters that we look at. Every single card is not going to be consistent, fit into your design goals, like non-toxic, like they're not going to meet every single bar, but cards should meet some of these bars in order to be a consideration for your cube.
I would say that just know that, even if you are playing with if you're discussing cards, right, and you're talking with people who are familiar with the cards, they're good card evaluators, that doesn't mean you're going to agree. There have been a lot of arguments, not like, knockdown dragouts or anything, but me and Chris have been getting in a bunch of little arguments over random cards, and we'll both present our points, right? We'll say back, sweaty. And we'll both present our points, give it back and forth. And like, we just value different things. We place different parts of this puzzle that we're talking about, the card evaluation puzzle, in different priorities, right? Certain aspects of a card stick out to us more than others, and there's strengths and weaknesses to both of that. And like, the idea is eventually, with some Tim input as well, we're going to come to like the consensus conclusion of like, what is the best card for that slot.
Yeah. I also wanted to, this again with the slot equity thing and basically everything we talk about, like I complain about this a lot, but one of the questions people love to ask, like especially when a new person comes, they play the cube once or twice, like the question they always ask is, why aren't you playing X? And it's like, okay, like I get it, X is a strong card. The question you should be asking is, why aren't you playing X instead of blank, the card that you are playing? Because there a ton, like you only have 360 slots and maybe 1,000 playable cards that could take those slots, right? Like, we're not playing X because we think the card that's in our cube is a better use of the same slot at the same mana value or whatever. So I think people could be better at giving feedback about why a card should be in the cube. Like, don't just suggest a card that's powerful and say, why isn't this in the cube? Tell me why it should be in the cube over something that we're already playing. Is it consistent? Like, is it something that our archetypes need? Like, does it fall into one of these categories? Is it a power outlier? If it's a power outlier, that's probably why we're not playing it, So, yeah, that question always bothers me. It's because, well, I mean, we're not playing it because it doesn't fall into one of these categories. Tell me why I should be playing it instead of something else. But that's just a minor gripe I want to throw in there at the end. I guess a good time to close this one out, since short, sweet, to the point.
Well, by like other podcast standpoints, this would be a pretty standard length, but for us, this is surprisingly succinct.
That's true. Yeah, it's like, am I supposed to drag this out? What am I supposed to talk about? You guys want to talk about?
The timer's only an hour 15, guys. We got like 30 minutes to go.
It's like when you're in a corporate meeting and like the meeting time is set for an hour and a half, and you get done in 45 minutes, and instead of giving everyone their time back, some dipshit in the room always finds a way to just like suck up the rest of the time. I'm
sure Teld gets that a lot as the teacher meetings.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
Meetings.
I won't even lie. I will say one great thing about the administration I work with is they are very conscious of our time. So it is quite, occasionally meetings will run over, but it is far more frequent for them to go, all right, well, this meeting was 45 minutes long and we finished in 20. Have a nice day.
Nice.
I wish. All right, well, let's close this out. So thanks to everyone for listening. Remember, best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank Podcast is to join that Discord server. Come draft with us. Give us your feedback, your proper feedback. Tell us why the card should be played instead of something else. Just don't tell us why isn't Hydroid Krasis in your cube? I don't know. Probably because Gilded Goose is better or Mother Goose is better or whatever.
Hydroid Krasis is not in our cube because it's not a great card anymore.
I think that's the most common response. Yeah, this card is not that good.
The Discord server, just come give us your feedback. It's great. I love having everybody there. Again, thanks to everybody who supported me in my thing that came up. But great place to talk with.
Jank Diver Gaming, a great place to have opinions.
Great place to have opinions. It's your online LGS at this point. I think a couple people think about it like that, and I think that's a good way to frame it. You can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this. We have a bunch of different scheduled events throughout the week. 4 days of drafting. We have our normal Jank Diver Cube on Sunday and Wednesday nights. We have our Peasant Cube Saturday nights. We have F&M style cubes, which is up to a player vote what you actually end up drafting. I think they drafted the Gold Cube on Friday. I could be wrong about that. It's like all gold cards. I haven't played that one yet, but it sounds like just absolute chaos, but that one happened on Friday. And then we have various Jank Diver Gaming cubes, user submitted cubes, admin submitted cubes on Saturday, Sunday mornings, and I think we've actually even scheduled chaos drafts on Saturday and Sunday mornings now, thanks to a member Janksta who wants to promote that more in the community. You can check out our socials, Twitter at Jank Diver Gaming, youtube.com/Jank Diver Gaming, where I have what I consider to be a really fun Outlaws of Thunder Junction draft that I did. Teld also put out the Peasant Cube video, which I had to butcher. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. Due to an audio quirk, I had to take out I had to take out the funny at the beginning of your video, but it wasn't intentional. But you can make up for it by watching Teld at twitch.tv/Teld Talks. So not sure what we're going to do in the future. We've got quite a while until Modern Horizons 3 coming out, about a month and a half before that, but that I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about. We'll have plenty of episodes in between. That's going to be it for this one, though, so thanks for listening to the Jank Tank podcast, and we will catch you all next time.
Oh, did want to go ahead before we sign off and throw a shout out to the Barbarian League. I don't know if you did we forget that?
Promote that for a second, because that's been cool.
Yeah, it's really been fun. We've had some interesting things going on. I really like it as a deck building exercise. If you're someone who likes to just put together decks more than actually playing, grinding through the ladder, you craft a sweet deck, you play, 5-7 matches, and then we move on to some sort of new deck building stipulation. So.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I wasn't able to participate in the last one, but this week we've got an interesting one where we have to play a Planeswalker commander, and then every other mana value in our deck has to have equivalent sections. So everybody's got like kind of a rectangular deck image, which is kind of cool. I actually thought that one was pretty interesting after the misery that was the second league. That was like you can't attack and you can't play creatures in your deck. That one was a little bit of a struggle for people to get through. But hopefully, I think we learned our lesson from that one. I think the intention was not for that to be miserable, and it just ended up being the way it was. And I think people are a little more cognizant of the fact that like certain stipulations shouldn't go together. So I think people are erring more on the let's do fun stipulations. Let's give people a little more breathing room. But yeah, Barbarians has been super fun. I'm glad you shouted that out. I should do that at the top of the episode if we're going to shout. I would like to get a couple more people in on it too. I think we've had a couple people who are like, this isn't for me, and that's perfectly fine. But it's fun for people who just like building decks. Even if you don't want to play your deck, it's fun to just build the deck. But I did have a sign off. I wanted to talk to you guys about video games for just a second.
Sure.
I think all three of us like consider ourselves gamers, like to some extent. I think you guys are actually probably more gamers than I am, because every time I'm on Discord, you guys are playing like something that I've never heard of or whatever.
Chris has been dragging me into Helldivers a bunch.
For what is it?
Yeah, we actually need to dive soon. It's been over a week for managed democracy.
Can you not play that game solo, or am I wrong?
The difficulty does not scale to the number of players, so if you're a good player and playing a mission on relatively easy difficulty, you can probably solo it, but yeah, it's not a game you can play solo. It's a game that, like, I have found the community to be pretty cool. Usually in games like this, I learn how to use sort of the in-game communication system of, like, tagging objectives and shit rather than being in chat. Mm-hmm. But I've actually met, like, maybe 6 or 7 people that were, like, good communicators, funny, smart, like, good to talk to type people, and I play with them regularly now. So the community does not suck. It's not like leaving your mic on in League or something.
Yeah, the bots and bugs are never going to destroy our way of life.
I prefer the solo experience of gaming. I've never been an online gamer, but what I wanted to mention here was... because I have a kid now. I have a 1-year-old, and like I spend so much time writing about Magic and playing Magic that I just like don't actually play that many games anymore. Plus, games, you guys have noticed, games are so expansive that like they're huge now that you can spend so much time on a single game before even like going to another one. But I did want to mention,
I don't consider the 150-hour advertisement. I don't consider that a plus. Don't tell me your game is 100 hours long. Give me something smaller.
As a completionist, I'm like, oh, Elden Ring, okay, I'll be on that for the next year. So I don't play as many games as I used to, despite still considering myself a gamer. But I think for the first time in a long time, there are a lot of games I'm anticipating coming up, and I just wanted to mention what those were real quick. One of them is Borderlands 4, which has not, I don't think, officially been announced, but it's like kind of soft been announced. Like everybody knows it's coming. And as far as multiplayer stuff goes, I don't like to play Borderlands like by myself. It's the only game I like to play with other people.
I'll play it with you. Hell yeah.
Yeah,
Borderlands 2 is great.
Yeah, Borderlands 2 is like an all-timer. Borderlands 3 is and some of the other stuff. And I was super disappointed with Tiny Tina's Adventure or whatever the hell it was called. I just didn't really vibe with that one. But whenever Borderlands 4 gets announced, I'm sure I'll be on that one because that's how me and my best friend used to like engage with each other was, hey, you want to hop on Borderlands? So looking forward to that one. There's a game coming out called Judas. It's made by the people who made BioShock. They have been kind of like dormant for a very long time. And BioShock, the first BioShock and the third BioShock, BioShock Infinite, are like, in my opinion, just masterclass storytelling video games. The second one's like kind of garbage rehash of the first one. Like you can just skip it completely. But BioShock Infinite is like an all-time game for me. It's got some of the best dialogue. Yeah, I know a lot of people don't agree with that opinion, but for me, like there's so much stuff in it that I appreciate.
Yeah. I think it's the worst of the three, but like I can see why people like it.
The second one is like objectively the worst of the three. But yeah, I know people don't share that opinion with me, but I love BioShock Infinite. There's certain lines of dialogue in there that I think are just like masterclass. Like how did they think of this type stuff? But Judas is a game that it's made by the same people. It's got the same feel to it. It actually has nothing to do with BioShock story wise, but it looks like a BioShock game. And it like takes place on a spaceship that's fallen apart. It's got that Rapture feel to it where like all of the citizens are like whacked out and crazy and stuff like that. So I'm looking forward to that because they kind of like did BioShock Infinite and then dropped off the face of the earth. And that was back in like 2011 or 2012 or something like that. So three other ones. So Slay the Spire 2 was officially announced. I know Teld is like hyped for Slay the Spire 2. Chris, have you ever played Slay the Spire, the first one?
No, I haven't. I know it seemed very popular with Magic players. But I never played it.
It is the best of that genre by a lot. It is I've played a number of the sort of roguelike deck builder games, and Slay the Spire is one of the earliest ones and still one of the best. It is incredible presentation, great balance, like crazy combos you can do, but also it's just fantastic, Chris. You'd probably love it.
Yeah, I think if you played it for like 30 minutes, you'd be like trying to get into the strategery of the whole thing, because it's like one of those simple games where you're playing as soon as you start it up, and then like it just immediately you're like, okay, there's a lot of depth to it. And I give it a lot of credit for being like maybe one of the most balanced games of all time as far as like card games go, because you have a starting deck where your strikes deal 6 damage, and it feels like 6 is like so much more significant than 5, but so less significant than 7. And it's just the type of game where that one number like makes a huge difference. And then you get the Watcher unlocked and you just win all the time, but whatever.
It is funny. Watcher's the class that, or the character that like people either say that it is the most broken or they cannot figure out how to play it.
It's not super complicated once you give it a couple goes. 2 other ones, Hades 2. I don't know if you guys have played Hades or if you're into that like kind of isometric gameplay style, but Hades is such an expertly made game in terms of the story, which I don't even care about the story in a lot of games, but the story is just like super engaging. It's evocative with all the Greek mythology stuff going on. The voice acting is excellent, which is something I never pay attention to in video games. The voice acting is just like fantastic. And it is probably the best example of a game that I've ever played where you feel like you're progressing as a player despite dying constantly. Like Dark Souls, sometimes you get stuck on a boss and you just like jam it 20 times until you learn the patterns. But Hades, you die, you get better, you die, you get better, you die, you get better. And it's just set up that way. It's so fun to play. There's a lot of customizability to it. Story-wise, like 10 out of 10 game. The sequel to it, I don't know if the sequel will stand up because you guys know I love Theros as a set, but Theros Beyond Death is like, okay, here's more Greek mythology.
Sure.
Like it's like more of the same. So I don't know if Hades 2 is going to hit the same way as far as the story goes, but the gameplay will be there.
Yeah, I played like 15, 20 hours of Hades. I thought it was really good. It's fantastic. One of the better versions of that game. I'm not into the faster roguelites quite as much. I tend to like the card games and the strategy games more, but it is a fantastic game. Excellent presentation. Supergiant, the company that makes it, has great, they have a number of great games. My favorite of theirs is Bastion, which is one of their earlier ones. It's not as good as Hades, but I just really liked the way that, again, presentation is like masterclass. Transistor was another game. I didn't actually enjoy the game. I didn't enjoy that one as much as I think I thought I would, because it looked like the exact kind of game I would fall in love with. Again, presentation is masterclass. Voice acting is great. Like the way that they do things is just, their presentation is incredible. Like that is something that they excel at.
Supergiant is known for treating their employees very well, and it shows in their games because their games are just super polished and great. I was going to mention Silksong as the 5th game here, but nobody even knows if Silksong's ever going to come out. That's a sequel to Hollow Knight, and I just recently played Hollow Knight because I'm perpetually 3 to 5 years behind on whatever games are coming out. But the last one,
that's a cool game.
Yeah, it's really fun. I get why people like it so much after having played it, and Silksong's just a sequel to it. So the last one, probably the one I'm most looking forward to, is Metal Gear Solid Delta, which is a modern day remake of Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, which is, I think, in my opinion, just like easily the best Metal Gear Solid game.
My favorite is 2, but
two is so wild and people give it shit, but it's so ahead of its time. two is like,
yeah. I mean, basically in Metal Gear Solid 2, I can never remember the guy who made Metal Gear Solid.
Hideo
What's his
Kojima.
name? Hideo Kojima. Like, Hideo Kojima literally predicted the future misinformation internet hellscape that is consuming the world alive right now back in like 2001.
Yeah. Metal Gear 2 is considered the first postmodern game. Like when people talk about it, they consider it like the era of postmodernism in video game, and it's like way ahead of its time. But then you fight like fat like bomb people on roller skates, and like you have to scratch your head a little bit, so it's a little weird, but that's a Hideo Kojima thing. But Snake Eater is such a good game. Like, it's so good.
Well, I was really annoyed by this when it happened, but in Metal Gear Solid 2, if you guys played that, do you remember the part where like you're stuck naked in this little tunnel?
Yeah.
And,
they keep
like,
calling you every 5
says
seconds.
Game over. Yeah, and it basically, you're just like, it's like, and that was before, that actually GameFAQs existed back then, but there were like a couple of points in that game where it was like, haha, joke's on you, you can't finish this fucking thing. And I really hated it at the time, but in retrospect, I'm like, yeah, like that was back when popular games could actually be creative and like a little deliberately frustrating, and they just really, they don't design as many like AAA games for actual nerds anymore, so I'm a little nostalgic for that.
Yeah, it's kind of impossible for me to talk about games I'm interested in this year with it's one item on the list. You know, Shadows of the Erdtree, that's the game I've been. I don't care about any. I honestly don't care about anything else. Shadow of the Erdtree is what I'm waiting for.
Man, I wish it had come out sooner. Not for polished reasons. I wish they'd take as long as they need to, but I really wish it'd come out sooner, because I was so immersed in Elden Ring, but once I put a game down, I never go back to it, and I won't do it for DLC. So like I'm just not ever going to play that. And it looks fantastic. Like, it's,
sure.
If it had come out like 6 months or something like that, I would be jamming it for sure. But I've already put the game down. I'm not going to relearn it or anything like that.
Yeah. The only other games, like, I mean, Stellar Blade looked kind of cool. I think that's a PS5 exclusive though. And then,
you like butts? You like people with butts?
No, it's just like with a game, like it looked like an interesting game. But then Frostpunk 2 is also coming out.
He's in it for the gameplay.
Oh yeah, I was going to mention Frostpunk 2. Like, I'm glad you even know about the game Teld, because Frostpunk is awesome. It's like, it's a weird combination of survival game and city builder.
Yeah, city management survival. Yeah, it's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So basically what happens in Frostpunk is it's like after a climate apocalypse, but it's set in the industrial era, and you start out with like a bunch of refugees and what's called the generator, which is like the only heat source available to you. And basically there's a timeline, and you can see when they're coming. There are these occasional massive drops in temperature, and you have to sort of optimize your build order to make sure that you are set to survive these massive like temperature plummets. Because if you don't have like proper insulation built in your houses or in your like work posts or whatever, people get sick, they die. It's definitely, like, it can be frustrating because it's a death spiral game. Like, you can get to a point in the progression where you're just utterly fucked, and the fact that you're utterly fucked just utterly fucks you more. But it is tremendous.
There's also, like,
fun.
this background morality system where, like, you can you have like different tiers of like laws you can implement. And as you go down, they get stricter and stricter and stricter, but they also increase your chances of survival. And like it doesn't really flesh it out in the first one very well, but there's this sort of like implicit morality system of like, you get to the end of the game, and if you survive, it's like to get the quote unquote good ending, I think, if I remember right, you have to like have not crossed a line, which requires you to have not gone so deep into the things, but not going that deep also made the game harder because you were making it more difficult to survive. So there's this like kind of balance going on of like how strict you want to be. And there's a couple of different like modules for it too, where they give you different circumstances. There's one where you're managing like, I think 2 cities, and there's one, I can't remember the exact thing, but it's got a couple of different things like that going on, and they have different stipulations. It's really, really cool.
It's a cool concept. Yeah.
Essentially at a certain point in the game, things become so difficult that in order to like keep your group alive, you basically have to choose a style of fascism to implement. And one is like theocratic fascism, to use like faith and branding people heretics to keep things under control, and the other is just like brutal police state, and you kind of have to choose which one you're gonna do.
Gotcha. So like StarCraft, but frozen ish. I mean, is it? There's no like antagonist though? It's just like you against the environment.
Well, you are the antagonist if you. This is where I was talking about. So like the early tiers of like the theology and police state are all like normal things, like having, night watch or having like church services. And then as you go down the trees, eventually it's like you have like heretical, like Inquisition, and you have like, cameras on all the corners or something like that. It's like you go down, and it's like eventually just like political prisoners and burning witches and stuff. And
that's cool.
Yeah. And so like there's this idea that like if you don't go too deep into them, you never quote unquote cross a line, and you maintain like a free civilization that did just enough to survive without like making its citizens essentially slaves.
Yeah, there's some pretty disturbing elements. Like if you choose religious fascism, one of the ways that you can like increase hope. So there's a combination of 2 things. There's hope and discontent that are dependent on like how well things are going. And like one of the ways that you can like reduce discontent and increase hope in the religious tree is you call a gathering for like everyone to walk around the generator and self-flagellate. Which is really, really fucking disturbing, but it's kind of like the concept is like increasing people's sense of religious devotion makes it easier for them to bear hardships, that kind of thing. So it's interesting. It's grim. It's very
I don't
grim.
mind stuff like that at all. My current game that I have been playing is Cult of the Lamb, which is like a cartoony version of that. It sounds like where you're sacrificing your followers to demons and stuff like that and whatnot. But as far as like city builders go, it's pretty bare bones. I've never really been a huge fan of that genre, but I like the concept of like you're not fighting aliens, you're fighting like the environment, you're fighting like morality or stuff like that. So that sounds pretty cool. But yeah, I just wanted to throw out a bunch of games that I'm excited coming out within the next year and a half or so. So thanks for indulging. I like to do a sign-offs, non-Magic related sign-offs every now and then. I thought that'd be a cool one.
Actually, I don't know if it's cool to say redheaded stepchild anymore, but I'm not worried about it. Make the sort of like the skit at the end of the episode just like my distorted voice saying redheaded stepchild in a bunch of different ways.
Drop the beat.
A redheaded stepchild. 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 I'm chopping some chicken. A redheaded stepchild. A redheaded stepchild. A redheaded stepchild. Deleterious. I'm just being a bitchy dipshit.